Before I talk about the nature of this dream that we dream, in fact whether it's a dream or a nightmare, let me first establish that we are in a dream, or as modern neuroscience would say, we live in a simulation. Now if you go back as far as you want to, in actual fact, you'll find that various sages and philosophers and now scientists are saying that we live in some kind of dream. So, starting with more recent people like Metzinger, who produced a book called The Ego Tunnel, Metzinger says that we live in a simulation, and he calls upon a large amount of contemporary neuroscience to establish that. Metzinger's a philosopher, he's not primarily a neuroscience person, but he uses it to justify his claims that we live in what is essentially a simulation. And in fact the self, that feeling you have of being someone, is a higher order simulation within the simulation that is your world or your universe. Let's go back a bit further to Kant. Kant said that space and time are parts of your consciousness. There's nothing out there. There is no out there. Out there is created by your consciousness, as is time, and time is an inner sense. One thing follows another. Even so, it's effectively a dream. And in fact, when you investigate the world, what you are investigating is your mind, because everything that is out there is part of the simulation, or to use Kant's language, is part of the a priori properties of the world, the properties that are imposed on your consciousness that are just ready-made. Space and time are ready-made, as is causality. Anyway, won't go into all of that. And then we go to Spinoza, who in part 2 of his Ethics goes to great pains to tell us over and over again that the world we perceive is confused. That's his word for it. Essentially he's saying it's a dream. He says we cannot know our own mind properly. We're not aware of huge amounts of what psychologists would call the unconscious. So we don't know our own mind, we don't know our own body, because the only way we know it is through our sensing of it, and the senses are part of the dream. And we don't know things that are out there, because things that are out there are also confused, to use his language, but essentially part of the dream. And then we go to Schopenhauer, who famously said, "The world is my representation." I mean, just a very, very succinct statement of it. In other words, the world is your dream. And let's go to Shakespeare. And in fact, I'll be quoting Shakespeare a couple of times. "We are such stuff as dreams are made on. Our little life is rounded with a sleep." Beautiful. That's from The Tempest. We are such stuff as dreams are made on. He's just saying through drama what philosophers and various sages have said throughout the ages. So if you can accept that your world is a dream or a simulation, or whatever term you want to apply to it, then whenever you move around, you're moving around in the dream of your making, and whatever you think is part of that dream. So how come we all more or less have the same dream if we're all dreaming? Well, Schopenhauer has the answer to this, and he says that we are all manifestations of one dream maker, what he calls the will to life. And the will to life is profligate, it is rapacious, it wants more and more manifestation. And so we see a huge diversity of creatures who sense things and who effectively live in their own kind of dream. Bats have a different dream to the dream you have, or that I have. You and I have a similar dream. We see things in more or less the same way. If I was to draw a tree and you were to draw a tree, it would look pretty much the same way. If a bat was to draw a tree, it would look wholly different. So individual species experience this dream in different ways. But what is a constant feature of the whole thing is this will to life pushing forward all the time to manifest itself in as many ways as possible. Now, this will to life that generates these dreams that we dream is blind. It has no conscious, it's an unconscionable thing. It has no awareness. It is not aware of what it is doing in actual fact, except maybe through man, who has this, to use the words of Metzinger, who has essentially a higher level simulation within the basic simulation. So we have a self that can observe the simulation, but that self itself is also a simulation. These things are not said glibly. To reach those conclusions has taken hundreds of years of research and the finest minds to look at the way the brain works. And one of those is a character called Antonio Damasio, who has shown that the feeling of self is located in a particular area of the brain. It's actually in the brain stem. And if this part of the brain becomes damaged, then a person loses all sense of self. They lose that higher level simulation. They can still operate, but they just have no sense of self. So, is this simulation a dream or is it a nightmare? Well, let me quote from Shakespeare again. And this is one of the most sinister things that I've ever heard. Because of course we all believe that when we die, you may believe that you pass on to be some kind of entity after you die, but a lot of people believe that there's just annihilation after death. But Shakespeare raises some kind of possibility that personally I would rather not think of. So here we go. This is from Hamlet. He says, "To die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come, when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, must give us pause." In other words, what he's saying is, maybe the dream doesn't end when the physical body dies. And could it possibly be much worse once we have shuffled off this mortal coil? And there goes my one hope for salvation. So, there are some interesting people on YouTube commenting on all this kind of thing. One of them is a guy called Immendham, I-M-M-E-N-D-H-A-M. Now he produces hundreds, maybe even thousands of videos of himself talking. And some of them are really, really just right on the nail about the nature of this dream that we dream. Its futility. The basic futility is that a generation comes, it has sex, it produces another generation. The first generation dies, the second generation has sex, produces another generation, that generation dies, blah blah blah, and it goes round and round and round. And he likens the struggle for existence to a gladiatorial combat, where there are no rules, there are no judges, any levels of savagery and bestiality are allowed, and looks at the whole thing and just proclaims that the whole thing is futile, as indeed did Schopenhauer. But there's an interesting angle in this. We, for whatever reason, the human race, is capable of recognizing that it is in a dream. And it's possible for us to become, well, I was going to say indifferent. We can never be totally indifferent to it, but we can at least not participate in it as fully as maybe other creatures have to. Because if you have no reflective capability, which most creatures do not have, then you're basically just a slave to the dream. You're part of the dream, you're in it, There's no thinking to yourself while you're in the dream, oh, I'm dreaming. But human beings can do that. They can say to themselves, oh, this is all constructed by my consciousness, it's a simulation. And actually, it's not all that much of a pleasant simulation. There's huge amounts of suffering and barbarity involved in this dream. And actually, I'd rather not be such an active participant in it. So Schopenhauer, towards the end of his masterwork, which is The World as Will and Representation, talks about his doctrine of the denial of the will to life. In other words, denying the will to life. That does not mean suicide. What it means is becoming largely indifferent to the nature of the will to life. The will to life is essentially desire. And we all have very strong sexual desires. It's very, very few people who can essentially negate that. I don't know if anybody can really negate the sexual desire. The Cathars, who were Gnostic Christians, recognized the futility and the barbarity of the whole thing and decided that they would not procreate, but they allowed themselves sexual expression in any way that did not result in conception. Anyway, to get back to the main point, the will to life is synonymous with desire. Desire for sex, desire for life, desire for food, desire for power, ambition, and so on. And of course, when you have billions of creatures all pushing to survive and having to kill each other in the process of trying to survive, then you have a formula for what is massive suffering. And in truth, the whole thing's a nightmare. And as far as man is concerned, this will to life manifests primarily through ambition. And my final quote from Shakespeare, again from Hamlet, says, "The very substance of the ambitious is merely the shadow of a dream." You know, Shakespeare knew something. I mean, all these beautiful lines hidden in his works. The very substance of the ambitious is merely the shadow of a dream. And that is what the will to life is. It is a dream, a shadow of a dream. Why is it like that? Well, various people have tried to explain it. The Gnostic Christians believe that the world that we know was created by a demiurge, an inferior god, and basically didn't know what it was doing and created this whole mess. Is that true? I don't know, but it's one idea. It's just one expression of abhorrence at the nature of this so-called reality, which is in effect a dream. So how to wake up from the dream? Well, you wake up from the dream by not identifying with it. It's as simple as that. You can take the model directly from when you are in a dream and you suddenly realize that you're in a dream when you're sleeping at night. It doesn't happen very often, but I imagine most people have experienced that. They're dreaming and they realize that they're in a dream. It's the same thing here. So to effectively disassociate yourself from the dream means to become indifferent to it and to know that you're in a dream and to become an observer of what is happening rather than an active participant. And that's hard work. But if you look at most religions and not a few philosophies, you'll find that that's the central message they're trying to give.